The forensic audit of the Senate hearing room initiates by establishing the exact physical parameters and biological baselines of the primary targets. The Keen-Hien VFAP-Lee forensic zoom algorithm immediately isolates the specific spatial coordinate occupied by former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. The optical sensors record a state of absolute unforced kinetic paralysis. The system measures the precise placement of her physical implements. Her writing pen is mathematically detached from her biological grip, stationed directly on the horizontal surface of the table, exactly 3 inches away from her physical fingers. The optical feed logs the angle of the object. It is structurally positioned in a manner that does not indicate a deliberate, calculated placement, but rather the mechanical angle of an object that has been completely surrendered. Simultaneously, her reading glasses are physically trapped within the kinetic hold of her left hand. The system logs their operational status as entirely useless. They are not actively deployed on her facial architecture for optical enhancement, nor are they positioned for immediate use. They function strictly as a dormant physical artifact that the operator mathematically no longer knows where to station. Her mandibular architecture is completely sealed, locking her physical mouth in a closed position. The forensic system processes the historical data matrix of the target to calculate the severity of this specific physical freeze. For exactly 37 chronological years, this specific biological operator has systematically treated acoustic silence as an external environmental condition assigned strictly to other human subjects. She is mathematically verified as the absolute architectural control center of the legislative grid. The system logs her historical capacity. She is the exact operator who has historically commanded institutional calendars, directed party caucuses, authorized floor votes, managed the corporate camera networks, and systematically dispensed operational consequences. However, within the current physical coordinate of the Senate hearing room, the operator who historically controlled the entire structural timeline is currently stationed in her chair with absolutely zero alphanumeric sentences prepared to execute a rescue protocol. The internal chronometer logs a severe behavioral anomaly. Exactly 11 chronological minutes prior to this absolute systemic freeze, her facial architecture had been actively engaged in a standard optical smile. The system shifts its primary optical sensors across the mahogany table to track the opposing coordinate, Vice President J.D. Vance. The audit measures his exact physical and acoustic initiation. Vance executes a deliberate mechanical sequence. He physically opens the lid of his laptop hardware and immediately initiates a visual lock onto the digital numbers displayed on the screen. The system logs the absolute absence of standard political interface protocols. He mathematically refuses to introduce the incoming data packet like a television host, artificially preparing an audience for a scheduled broadcast segment. He systematically strips all theatrical decoration from his physical output. There is absolutely zero deployment of artificial emotional outrage, zero performative sarcasm, and zero activation of standard moral theater. Furthermore, Vance actively denies the target the institutional courtesy of an acoustic warning. He does not verbally broadcast that the operational timeline is about to shift toward the Visa Corporation. He mathematically refuses to provide a comfortable historical overview to soften the atmospheric pressure of the room. The acoustic sensors measure his initial vocal transmission. He directs his optical focus entirely downward, physically refusing to engage the target's visual sensors. He begins reading the raw alphanumeric data directly into the active microphone. The system categorizes his exact vocal frequency. It is completely flat, mechanically dry, and structurally unforgiving. The acoustic signature mathematically mirrors the exact tone of an operational auditor reading aloud a terminal financial invoice that the target had systematically hoped was permanently lost from the federal record. The physical parameters of the collision are now permanently locked, and the extraction of the numerical matrix officially begins. The acoustic sensors capture the exact alphanumeric sequence J.D. Vance inputs into the permanent federal record. He establishes the first chronological and financial coordinate, March 2008. He reads the precise transactional data directly from the glowing screen. Paul Pelosi executes a physical purchase of 5,000 shares of the Visa Corporation. He logs the exact entry price, $44 per individual share, mathematically executed strictly at the initial public offering, IPO valuation. The Kin-Hien v. Fap-Lee forensic zoom algorithm pauses to mathematically classify the structural nature of this specific transaction. Vance's flat acoustic delivery structurally confirms that this was absolutely not a standard retail order accessible to the civilian public. It was mathematically impossible for an average biological subject occupying the American exterior to secure this specific transactional parameter by simply opening a standard brokerage account after completing a workday. The system logs it as a verified preferential allocation. The Pelosi household was systematically invited into the largest initial public offering in the chronological history of the American financial grid, securing access while the asset was strictly priced for internal operators before the external public was legally permitted through the institutional door. The acoustic sensors note that Vance transmits this massive structural anomaly with the exact same unvaried cadence a subject would utilize to report localized weather conditions. Vance immediately overlays the financial coordinate with the corresponding legislative baseline. He defines the exact institutional parameters of Nancy Pelosi during that specific chronological window. She was functioning as the active Speaker of the House. The system translates this title into raw operational physics. She was mathematically not just another elected official floating around Washington with opinions. She possessed absolute mechanical control over the federal architecture. She structurally dictated which legislative packets reached the physical floor, which packets were terminated in committee, which issues received operational oxygen, and which directives were quietly suffocated before the civilian voting matrix ever learned their alphanumeric names. Vance inputs the intersection at the exact temporal moment of the Visa stock acquisition. Active legislation engineered to reform credit card swipe fees was physically moving through the House grid. The system logs that this specific legislative packet was strongly and actively opposed by the Visa Corporation. The legislation was operating entirely under the structural shadow of Pelosi's absolute speaker power. Vance maintains his downward optical lock. The system notes that elevating his visual sensors would mathematically provide the room with a theatrical performance, and he is structurally determined to completely seal off even that minor escape hatch. He reads the subsequent temporal metric. Exactly 2 chronological days after the initial purchase, the Visa asset traded at a public valuation of $64. He calculates the immediate financial yield. The Pelosi household mathematically extracted approximately $100,000 in exactly 48 hours. The system logs the structural weight of this extraction. The capital was not generated through standard labor, not through the mechanical grinding of payroll, not from building a small shop, and not through 20 chronological years of disciplined savings. It was generated exclusively by being allowed into a restricted institutional door the civilian public mathematically never saw. Vance inputs the final parameter of the 2008 coordinate. He states into the microphone, the credit card reform legislation did not receive a floor vote that session. The forensic system measures the immediate atmospheric reaction. Vance mathematically allows that specific sentence to physically suspend in the acoustic space for a longer duration than any prior transmission. He absolutely does not deploy an acoustic accusation. He does not verbally state that the operator who controlled the floor systematically killed a specific bill that would have mathematically damaged the asset her household had just acquired. He mechanically recognizes that the silence carries the terminal conclusion significantly cleaner than his own vocal frequency ever could. The system logs the cruel efficiency of the operational sequence, the chronological dates, the financial stock, the legislative bill, and the missing physical vote systematically arrange themselves into an interlocking geometric shape that absolutely no institutional spin doctor possesses the mechanical capacity to smooth over. Every biological subject occupying the hearing room mathematically understands the structural gap between what was spoken and what was obvious. Because the audit requires absolute structural verification, Vance mathematically refuses to terminate the Visa sequence. He shifts the temporal coordinate to the year 2011, signaling he will deploy the target's own acoustic output to execute the final closure. He introduces verified external data, an active CBS 60 Minutes transmission where media operative Steve Croft initiated a direct query regarding the Visa transaction and the intersecting credit card legislation. Vance reads Pelosi's exact historical response into the live microphone, deploying it cold and plain without executing a single kinetic eyebrow raise or offering the mercy of rhetorical interpretation. He inputs her verbatim quote, "I don't know what your point is of your question." The forensic system isolates this alphanumeric sequence. Vance immediately seals his physical mouth, leaving the quote suspended in the high thermal lighting of the room. The system logs the quote as an ugly, self-sufficient mechanical artifact that mathematically requires zero external assistance from Vance or anyone else to inflict maximum structural damage. He absolutely refuses to acoustically label the quote as evasive or arrogant. He simply places her defensive algorithm, a dodge, artificially dressed up as indignation and confusion directly next to the raw mathematical numbers, allowing the two data points to continuously react. The optical sensors scan the secondary rows of the auditorium to measure the collateral impact of the data collision. The feed isolates a verified legislative aide stationed exactly in the second row. This specific operative possesses a 9-year chronological history of watching the Washington apparatus successfully survive institutional scandals by systematically suffocating them. The system records his immediate kinetic reaction. He physically extracts his mobile device and rapidly types exactly 3 alphanumeric words. This is bad. The Visa anomaly has successfully breached the internal perimeter. Algorithm shifts its primary optical sensors exactly 6 physical feet away from the legislative aide, locking directly onto former Speaker Nancy Pelosi's localized coordinate. The system measures a new acoustic anomaly. The plastic writing pen, previously lying dormant on the mahogany surface, is now utilized to execute exactly 1 small, sharp mechanical tap against the table. The audio frequency of this singular impact almost entirely dissipates under the ambient ventilation hum and the continuous mechanical shutter clicks of the corporate camera network. However, the system logs it as a mathematically significant event. It functions as a verified physical leak of internal biological pressure, occurring precisely while the target's facial architecture simultaneously attempts to project absolute operational control. In the highly calibrated perimeter of Washington, specialized operatives are systematically compensated to register exactly this category of kinetic failure. The optical feed tracks Vice President J.D. Vance's right hand. He executes a slow, deliberate downward scroll on his laptop trackpad. The system records the atmospheric shift within the room. The audience mathematically processes this specific kinetic motion as an indicator that the 2008 Visa anomaly was absolutely not a terminal destination, but structurally functions strictly as a foundational baseline. Vance inputs the next alphanumeric sequence directly into the active microphone, July 2021. He reads the corresponding financial transaction. Paul Pelosi purchases 5,000 shares of Nvidia. The forensic audit immediately overlays the congressional timeline onto this financial coordinate. At the exact chronological moment of this specific asset acquisition, the federal legislative apparatus was actively initiating structural work on the CHIPS and Science Act. Vance defines the parameters of this legislation, a massive $52 billion federal subsidy package engineered strictly to amplify the American semiconductor industry. Nvidia mathematically functioned as one of the most critical corporate entities within that exact sector, structurally positioned to absorb massive capital from the impending legislative wind Washington was preparing to blow. Vance executes this data drop, maintaining his absolute machine-like calm. The acoustic sensors confirm he mathematically refuses to escalate his vocal volume or inject performative noise, structurally recognizing that excess noise would mathematically provide the target with an operational advantage. The system logs that numerical digits function with a significantly higher degree of cleanliness, verified dates are mathematically harder to deny, and a chronological timeline this tight absolutely does not require a verbal sermon to execute its function. The audit proceeds. Vance reads the subsequent temporal metric, June 2022. He details the transaction. Paul Pelosi exercises call options and purchases an additional 20,000 shares of Nvidia. He logs the monetary scale. The verified value of this specific maneuver ranges mathematically between $1 million and $5 million. The system notes that the political apparatus has systematically trained the civilian public to process this massive variance in wealth as a standard vague metric, but the structural weight of the capital remains absolute. Vance aligns the timeline again. During this exact chronological window, the CHIPS Act was physically moving toward a final floor vote. The system logs the unalterable institutional reality. Nancy Pelosi mathematically retained her position as the active Speaker of the House, maintaining absolute control over the legislative calendar and the physical timing of the vote. She systematically occupied the exact structural intersection where federal lawmaking and financial market movement overlapped with highly coordinated proximity. Vance mathematically refuses to ask the room to deploy its imagination because the rigid calendar dates are actively executing the acoustic transmission on his behalf. July 2022. Vance reads the terminal legislative result. The CHIPS and Science Act passes the House under Speaker Pelosi's leadership, providing $52 billion in subsidies to semiconductor manufacturers. The system logs the financial reaction. The Nvidia asset had systematically escalated in market valuation in direct anticipation of this exact federal action. The verified fact lands on the horizontal surface of the table with the precise mechanical weight of a loaded file. The optical sensors track a quarter-turn physical shift in Pelosi's posture. She executes a minor kinetic rotation directly toward her stationed attorney. The system classifies this movement not as overt biological panic, but as the exact microscopic adjustment. An operator's physical body executes a fraction of a second before the cognitive matrix formally approves the motion. It is the specific structural reaction a biological operator deploys upon realizing a measured timeline has mathematically escalated into a lethal threat. She activates her microphone to deploy a standard defensive algorithm. She acoustically states that her husband executed his own independent investment decisions and that the transactions were mathematically public. The system logs this response as the familiar, highly polished Washington terminology of compliance, disclosure, and technical innocence. Vance systematically overrides this defense without pausing his downward scroll. The forensic audit locks onto the mathematical reality of her statement. Executing a public disclosure strictly after a financial transaction is finalized absolutely does not magically erase the structural query of what precise legislative data was known before the trade was executed. Vance inputs the final coordinate of this specific sequence, July 2022. He reads the result of the increasing external optical pressure. Under media scrutiny, Paul Pelosi sells all 25,000 Nvidia shares and realizes a loss of approximately $341,000. The system logs that this specific financial loss might have successfully functioned as a defensive shield if the chronological timeline mathematically terminated at that exact coordinate. However, the timeline absolutely did not terminate. The optical feed registers Vance's hand executing another slow, deliberate scroll on the trackpad. The system records the atmospheric pressure within the room becoming increasingly dense. The mechanical motion of his right hand structurally registers as a highly surgical extraction, systematically cutting away the target's defensive layers piece by piece, preparing to expose a significantly larger financial anomaly stationed directly beneath the CHIPS Act matrix. The forensic audit of the timeline resumes as Vice President J.D. Vance executes a secondary extraction sequence regarding the Nvidia asset. The system logs that the temporary financial loss generated by the media scrutiny of the CHIPS Act mathematically functions strictly as a pause, not a termination. Vance introduces the next alphanumeric coordinate into the acoustic space, November 2023. He reads the specific transactional data directly from the glowing screen. Paul Pelosi purchases 50 call options on Nvidia, with the value of the transaction between $1 million and $5 million. The Kin-Hien V FAP-Li forensic zoom algorithm zeroes in on the exact chronological timestamp of the federal disclosure document. Vance pauses his acoustic transmission to allow the specific date to mathematically settle over the room. The system records the verified filing coordinate. The paperwork was officially submitted on the exact Friday immediately preceding the Christmas holiday weekend. Vance does not deploy a theatrical smirk, nor does he acoustically label the filing date as sinister. He simply isolates the phrase Friday before Christmas and allows it to function as a self-sufficient structural accusation. The system categorizes this specific temporal coordinate as a verified institutional news hole. It is mathematically defined as the exact chronological window Washington operatives instinctively exploit when they are legally required to make a document public, but structurally desire it to be completely buried underneath the logistical clutter of civilian travel plans, closed administrative offices, domestic family dinners, and an external population whose optical sensors are temporarily disconnected from the political grid. Vance scrolls to the terminal result of this specific transaction. He outputs the financial metric. By the midpoint of the chronological year 2024, those specific call options mathematically generated approximately $4 million in pure profit in exactly 6 months. The system logs the absolute structural weight of the data packet. The capital extraction occurred on an asset inextricably tied to a corporate sector previously amplified by legislation that had systematically moved through the House of Representatives entirely under Pelosi's active speakership. Vance mathematically refuses to explicitly state this connection as a criminal charge because the rigid sequence of the timeline had already executed the indictment on his behalf. The atmospheric pressure inside the hearing room undergoes a severe, measurable alteration. The system records absolutely no loud gasps and no acoustic murmurs. Instead, it measures a slow, mechanical tightening across the physical grid of 200 biological subjects. The audience is mathematically processing the structural expansion of the anomaly. The event is officially no longer isolated to the 2008 Visa controversy, nor is it confined to a single awkward television interview. The Kin-Hien V FAP-Li forensic zoom algorithm logs the exact geometric shape of the pattern now visible in the room. Visa, followed by Nvidia, followed by active legislation, followed by call options, followed by precise temporal timing, followed by massive profit, followed by perfectly calculated disclosure. Each individual alphanumeric piece lands in an absolute sequence with zero wasted kinetic movement. The optical sensors isolate Pelosi's facial architecture. Her biological system continues to project an image of rigid composure, but the forensic system logs that maintaining this specific posture is now structurally registering as intense physical labor. When atmospheric pressure breaches a specific metric, biological work invariably becomes visible to the optical grid. Vance mathematically refuses to halt his reading, structurally forcing her to sit completely still while the permanent record systematically catches up to her financial reality. January 2025. Vance outputs the next chronological coordinate. He reads the transaction. Paul Pelosi purchases an additional $250,000 to $500,000 in Nvidia shares. The system aligns the temporal data. This specific acquisition was executed mere days before the physical inauguration of a new presidential administration. Vance mathematically refuses to decorate this timing as corrupt. He merely places the financial trade directly beside the chronological moment. He allows the room to process the established Washington protocol. When the institutional camera grid is completely distracted by the optical theater of power transfer, ceremony, and headlines designed to swallow the public attention span, highly optimized operators actively deploy capital. Vance executes another trackpad scroll. The acoustic sensors register the room physically tightening before the subsequent alphanumeric sequence is even transmitted. December 2025 through January 2026. Vance reads the data. Paul Pelosi executes a series of transactions totaling approximately $69 million. Vance systematically pauses his acoustic output strictly on the total mathematical sum. He does not execute this pause because he lost his visual place on the screen, nor does he seek audience applause. He pauses because a $69 million capital reallocation mathematically demands the structural humiliation of absolute silence around it. He breaks down the components of the massive financial maneuver. He reads the asset liquidations, $50 million in Apple shares, $5 million in Nvidia shares, and $5 million in Disney shares. He sequentially reads the newly acquired positions, call options in Alphabet, Amazon, Nvidia, Tempest AI, and Vistra Corporation. The forensic system logs the scale of the operation, $69 million completely repositioned within a single federal filing. The system categorizes this mathematically. It is absolutely not a gradual, casual adjustment executed by a standard biological family managing a retirement account. It is the exact structural equivalent of a highly weaponized, powerful household mechanically relocating an entire financial battlefield before the civilian public even realizes the geographic theater of war has shifted. Vance drops the disclosure coordinate into the acoustic space. The paperwork was officially filed on January 23rd, exactly 3 days prior to the presidential inauguration. It was deployed into one of the absolute busiest political news cycles existing on the American calendar. The optical sensors confirm that during that precise window, every broadcast camera in Washington was structurally locked onto marble steps, physical security fences, motorcades, and the ceremonial drama systematically engineered to distract the country from the administrative paperwork functioning underneath. Vance initiates direct optical contact with the room and delivers the structural conclusion. That was not an accident because you do not file $69 million in trades during inauguration week because it slipped your mind earlier. The Kinhien-V FAP-Lee forensic zoom algorithm measures the acoustic vacuum inside the room. It is mathematically verified as the technical silence of 200 human processors actively computing volume, density, dates, asset prices, and filing timelines in a chain structurally too clean to be dismissed as random noise. Vance maintains his flat, Ohio-based rhythm, trusting the raw spreadsheet data significantly more than a political speechwriter. The system shifts focus back to the target. Pelosi's physical pen is absolutely no longer executing a single, isolated tap against the mahogany. The acoustic sensors log a continuous, rapid mechanical sequence. The retractable mechanism is actively being pushed in and released, pushed in and released. It functions as a highly nervous, erratic metronome operating directly on the polished wood. Her stationed attorney executes a kinetic movement, placing his physical hand directly into her optical field of vision without initiating actual biological contact. The system classifies this specific protocol. It is the exact mechanical gesture legal operatives deploy when their target is actively executing a dangerous physical behavior without internal awareness. Pelosi mathematically refuses to terminate the clicking mechanism, structurally dropping the thermal temperature of the room even further. Simultaneously, the audit tracks an external coordinate. In the marble hallway outside the physical doors, where administrative staffers are mathematically required to suppress biological panic to maintain professional optics, Pelosi's communications director assumes a defensive posture. She stands with her physical back pressed directly against the architectural wall, her mobile device locked against her ear. She is mathematically not transmitting audio. She is exclusively receiving it. The incoming data completely drains the biological color from her facial architecture. The acoustic sensors capture her quiet terminal diagnostic broadcasted to the empty hallway. She needs to stop engaging. He's not going to stop reading. The system confirms the operative's calculation is absolutely correct. Vance mathematically refuses to terminate the reading protocol. The forensic audit measures a deliberate, highly calculated shift in Vice President J.D. Vance's operational rhythm. Having successfully deployed the massive $69 million reallocation matrix, the Keen-Hien Vi-Fapli forensic zoom algorithm logs that he does not advance the chronological timeline forward into the new year. Instead, he executes a hard structural regression. He announces into the active microphone that he intends to systematically return to the exact geographic and financial coordinate where the audit initially began, the Visa Corporation. Vance utilizes the laptop trackpad to execute a precise scroll to a new alphanumeric entry. The system records the immediate atmospheric reaction. The biological subjects occupying the auditorium mathematically process the reality that the 2008 Visa anomaly had absolutely not been left behind in the historical record. It had structurally been placed in a state of suspended waiting. Vance reads the updated temporal coordinate, fall 2024. He outputs the corresponding transactional data. Paul Pelosi sells more than $500,000 in Visa stock. The optical sensors log a significant kinetic deviation in Vance's posture. For the absolute first time since the Nvidia data sequence initiated, he physically elevates his optical focus away from the glowing screen. He does not establish a direct visual lock onto Nancy Pelosi. Instead, he systematically sweeps his optical sensors across the physical room, looking directly at the corporate camera network and the civilian gallery, the exact biological operators mathematically required to carry this data packet to the external grid. He drops the corresponding federal enforcement metric into the acoustic space. He states that shortly after the massive liquidation of the Visa asset, the United States Department of Justice officially announced an antitrust lawsuit directed explicitly against Visa, causing the corporate stock valuation to experience a severe downward decline. Vance executes a highly controlled physical maneuver, placing both of his hands completely flat on the horizontal table on either side of the laptop hardware. He proceeds to deliver the absolute cleanest mathematical translation of the operational pattern to the room. He states, in 2008, buy Visa before favorable legislative inaction, and in 2024, sell Visa before federal enforcement. He locks the final parameters of the loop. It is the exact same corporate entity, executed by the exact same biological family, separated by exactly 16 chronological years. He reduces the complex financial architecture down to its rawest mechanical algorithm. Buy the asset immediately before the unreleased positive data, and systematically sell the asset immediately before the unreleased negative data. The optical feed tracks an immediate biological intercept initiated by Pelosi's stationed attorney. The legal operative physically leans toward her localized coordinate and executes a highly compressed, whispered acoustic transmission directly into her auditory receptors. The system logs Pelosi's kinetic response. She executes a tight, restricted physical shaking of her head. The algorithm categorizes this specific motion as a multifaceted mechanical output that mathematically functions as a simultaneous transmission of "not now, I know," and a structural command to stop. Vance mathematically ignores the internal legal intercept. He executes a physical reach into the analog folder stationed beside his digital hardware. The system logs that he extracts the absolute first piece of non-digital physical paper utilized during the entire operational sequence. He introduces the document into the acoustic record. He states that he actively commissioned an independent, highly verified statistical analysis regarding the Pelosi household's trading architecture strictly concerning the Nvidia asset between the chronological years 2021 and 2026. He defines the exact parameters of the mathematical model. The analysis systematically compared the precise timing of their entry and exit coordinates against the S&P 500 baseline and cross-referenced the data against a completely randomized model of comparable financial trades. Vance reads the terminal statistical result into the microphone. The mathematical probability of achieving this specific temporal pattern of asset timing through pure biological chance alone was exactly 0.3%. He physically places the paper document directly onto the mahogany table. The system notes he executes this placement with the exact kinetic motion of an operator delivering a financial receipt that absolutely nobody in the physical room possesses the desire to sign. Vance repeats the metric to ensure absolute acoustic saturation, 0.3%. He translates the percentage into a raw fraction, 1 inch 300. He states the mathematical absurdity of a single household successfully executing a sequence where they repeatedly purchase assets prior to legislation and liquidate assets prior to federal enforcement, operating on the exact same corporate stocks across the exact same chronological years, strictly within the precise industrial sectors where the Speaker of the House possessed verified institutional influence. He inputs his own biological baseline data into the room. He explicitly notes his geographical origin in Ohio, confirms he has physically occupied commercial casinos, and structurally concludes that absolutely no human subject is biologically that lucky. He seals the parameter. Mathematically, an operator does not hit that exact metric 300 consecutive times. The Kin-Hien v. Fap-Lee forensic Zoom algorithm tracks Vance as he immediately produces a second physical document. The kinetic deployment of this secondary paper generates an instantaneous atmospheric collapse inside the auditorium. The system logs that the operational conflict is mathematically no longer restricted strictly to public federal filings or suspicious chronological timing. Vance acoustically identifies the object. It is a verified internal memorandum originating directly from the Visa Corporation's Government Affairs Division. The document contains a rigid chronological timestamp, February 2008. Vance reads the internal corporate text, noting the memo explicitly references IPO allocation utilizing the highly sanitized terminology legislative stakeholder households. He reads the lethal alphanumeric sequence verbatim into the federal record. Allocation confirmed for Pelosi household. Government relations team notes timing aligned with swipe fee markup schedule. Vance executes a physical alignment of the two paper documents. He positions the internal Visa memo exactly parallel to the independent statistical analysis, aligning the physical edges with extreme geometric precision. The system notes this motion is executed as if the mahogany table mathematically required absolute structural order before the room could physically absorb the massive institutional disorder the documents represent. He outputs the terminal calculation. Visa's own internal biological operatives systematically connected the initial public offering allocation directly to the pending federal legislation. The system verifies the source. It was absolutely not Vance. It was not a hostile media reporter, and it was not a conservative political watchdog entity. It was Visa's own institutional employees transmitting data in their own verified alphanumeric words. The system logs the mechanical purity of the strike. The absolute most devastating evidence in the Washington perimeter is systematically always the physical document an operator authored before they biologically realized it would mathematically matter. Vance structurally understands he possesses absolutely zero need to deploy the acoustic word corrupt. He mathematically does not need to accuse any subject of a federal crime, nor does he need to claim the existence of secret, unverified knowledge. He physically possesses the corporate memo, the chronological timeline, the federal disclosure filings, the mathematical profits, the minor tactical losses, and the institutional calendar. The optical sensors execute a final scan of the target's coordinate. The system verifies an absolute cessation of mechanical noise. The retractable mechanism of Pelosi's pen is completely and permanently quiet. This algorithm tracks the immediate physical aftermath of the Visa memorandum deployment. Vice President J.D. Vance executes a highly deliberate bilateral kinetic movement utilizing both of his physical hands. He applies direct mechanical force to the exterior casing of the laptop hardware, physically pushing the entire apparatus to the side of his localized workspace. The system logs the exact parameters of this action. He mathematically refuses to close the lid, and he absolutely does not attempt to hide the digital screen. He simply relocates the physical object away from his central coordinate, executing the mechanical motion of an operator, signaling that the initial extraction sequence is permanently terminated and a structurally heavier protocol is actively being brought to the mahogany table. The optical sensors record a massive spatial alteration within the perimeter. For exactly 15 continuous minutes, Vance had functioned exclusively as a biological machine, systematically feeding dates, dollar amounts, federal filings, trade executions, financial profits, tactical losses, and verbatim quotes directly into the public record. The system notes that the laptop screen had previously functioned as a physical and optical barrier between his coordinate and the auditorium. The mechanical removal of that specific barrier instantly alters the atmospheric pressure of the room. The acoustic sensors measure the ambient sound profile. The hearing room absolutely does not escalate in decibel level. Instead, it structurally tightens into a state of hyper-attentiveness, a specific atmospheric condition that Washington operatives mathematically recognize as highly lethal for any target actively under pressure. The system logs that Vance is no longer reading a digital spreadsheet. He is initiating a sequence engineered to force the spreadsheet to output raw, unvarnished arithmetic. Vance activates his microphone. The acoustic frequency remains perfectly flat, controlled, and quiet. He drops a single, highly compressed alphanumeric sentence into the room. Now I want to do some math. He deliberately decreases the kinetic pace of his vocal output, engineering the transmission so that every individual numerical digit lands in the acoustic space as an isolated physical object. He establishes the first baseline variable. He reads the official federal compensation metric for a senior member operating within the House of Representatives, exactly $223,500 per chronological year. He explicitly acknowledges the mathematical variance that the Speaker's salary achieved slightly higher metrics during specific annual cycles. However, the system logs a highly calculated tactical maneuver. Vance states he will strictly utilize the lower numerical baseline to be mathematically generous. He systematically refuses to pretend his calculation is a perfect historical ledger. He inputs intentional generosity directly into the equation because allocating the maximum mathematical benefit of the doubt structurally renders the resulting financial gap significantly more brutal. He inputs the temporal multiplier, 37 verified chronological years stationed within the congressional architecture. He executes the multiplication protocol and outputs the exact career salary total, $8,269,500. He mathematically compresses the digit for the acoustic record, instructing the room to call it $8.3 million. Vance physically allows that specific number to suspend in the air. The system notes that 8.3 million structurally registers as a massive volume of capital until it is mathematically placed directly adjacent to the secondary variable. He introduces the target's financial accumulation matrix. He extracts data from her most recent federal financial disclosures and independent tracking analyses. He outputs the estimated net worth of Speaker Pelosi. The metric mathematically fluctuates between a baseline of $120 million and a ceiling of $280 million, strictly dependent on the specific analytical source. Vance again deploys his generosity protocol. He selects the exact midpoint coordinate, $200 million. The forensic audit logs the initiation of the primary subtraction algorithm. Vance executes the calculation with the absolute coldness of basic arithmetic. $200 million minus the $8.3 million in total verified career salary. The mathematical output is exactly $191.7 million. Vance poses a highly localized structural query. Where did the other $191 million come from? The acoustic sensors measure the auditorium's biological response. The physical grid of human subjects absorbs the numerical data with the exact mechanical efficiency of dry, concrete-absorbing physical water. The absorption is immediate and mathematically permanent. The system logs 0 dramatic reactions, 0 gasps, and 0 murmurs of confusion. The numerical mass is structurally too large to process as a sudden shock and fundamentally too simple to generate intellectual debate. It is absolutely not a partisan campaign insult, nor is it a cable television slogan. It is raw subtraction. The Kin-Hien v. Fop-Lee forensic zoom algorithm categorizes basic subtraction as a verified, highly destructive weapon specifically engineered to humiliate biological operators who systematically construct their entire defensive perimeter entirely out of institutional complexity. Vance mathematically refuses to leave the equation incomplete. He announces his intention to actively account for every single legitimate, historically verifiable source of external capital he can locate. The optical feed records his physical right hand. He elevates his biological fingers, manually counting each distinct financial category. The system logs this kinetic gesture as an operational dare, mathematically challenging the target's legal defense to acoustically complain that he had not been generous enough. He systematically inputs the legitimate external variables. Variable 1, regional real estate appreciation localized in San Francisco and the Napa Valley spanning 37 years. Vance assigns a highly generous estimated value of $20 million. Variable 2, Paul Pelosi's independent venture capital infrastructure verified to exist prior to the target entering the federal grid. Vance assigns a generous growth estimate of $15 million. Variable 3, standard baseline market returns executed on their original $3 million net worth from the chronological year 1987, mathematically compounded at an 8% annual rate for exactly 37 years. Vance calculates the yield at approximately $48 million. He physically lowers his hand, terminating the counting sequence. He outputs the total sum of all legitimate, fully accountable external wealth, approximately $83 million. He mathematically reminds the room that he systematically rounded up the digits, stretched the analytical assumptions, and granted absolute leniency before arriving at that specific coordinate. Vance then executes the terminal subtraction sequence. The system logs this secondary equation as significantly colder than the first because absolutely every verified escape route has already been quantified and sealed. He inputs the final alphanumeric output into the live microphone. $200 million minus $83 million equals exactly $117 million. He attaches the terminal condition to the digit. This specific mass exists with absolutely no clean explanation attached to it. The forensic system tracks the destruction of all potential defensive algorithms. Absolutely no federal congressional salary mathematically explains it. Absolutely no ordinary biological inheritance explains it. absolutely no publicly available, civilian-accessible investment strategy structurally explains it. Finally, absolutely no polite, highly optimized Washington terminology possesses the physical capacity to shrink it into a harmless anomaly. The $117 million numerical void physically hangs within the atmospheric pressure of the hearing room. The system logs that this specific numerical mass mathematically exceeds the cognitive processing capacity of a standard human mind, attempting to absorb it in a single biological breath. It forces the operators in the room to visually walk around it, stare at its physical dimensions, and mathematically measure its weight against the biological subject sitting directly beside it. Vance mathematically refuses to assign a verbal name to the void, and the system confirms that this specific acoustic restraint renders the numerical data exponentially more lethal. He explicitly notes that every operator stationed within the grid possesses the mathematical capability to execute that calculation without his operational assistance. For the absolute first time in the chronological sequence, the institutional architecture's highly trained habit of avoiding the obvious mathematically runs out of physical space to hide. The forensic audit transitions past the numerical void as Vice President J.D. Vance systematically anchors the abstract mathematical data to a real biological human framework. He announces into the active microphone that he will permit the arithmetic to stand on its own merits and advance the operational parameters. However, the system logs that he does not alter the core tracking vector. Instead, he introduces an extreme socio-economic contrast directly into the permanent federal record. He inputs the precise data parameters of his maternal grandmother. He establishes her occupational and geographic coordinates, an industrial employee who executed manual labor at Armco Steel, physically located within the perimeter of Middletown, Ohio, for exactly 30 continuous chronological years. The Keen-Hien V FAPLI forensic zoom algorithm measures an immediate, profound shift in the behavioral profile of the auditorium. The movement across the human grid has absolutely nothing to do with physical chairs, paper documents, or camera lenses. The system logs that the entire room collectively processes the reality that the conflict has officially crossed the boundary from cold regulatory disclosures directly into lived human memory. Vance reads her historical employment metrics into the microphone. He logs her precise entry point. She initiated her employment directly on the factory floor, maintained that exact physical position for 3 decades, and systematically retired from that exact same factory floor. He inputs her maximum financial compensation. At the absolute peak of her 30-year chronological timeline of physical labor, her annual compensation mathematically maxed out at exactly $32,000. He applies a comparative financial audit to her coordinate. He logs that she mathematically possessed absolutely zero access to a professional financial advisor. She possessed zero corporate call options. She maintained absolutely no cognitive understanding of what an initial public offering structurally constituted, and the system verifies that no external institutional network was executing private invitations to usher her through the door before the public asset was priced for the retail market. Vance refuses to soften his vocal transmission, and the forensic system logs that this specific acoustic flat knee and tuck causes the narrative data to strike the target with significantly higher physical velocity. He reads her retirement metrics. She officially exited the labor grid with a standard pension that mathematically distributed exactly $1,200 per chronological month. She held absolute ownership of her residential structure solely because she executed her physical mortgage payments on time every single month for 30 years. He introduces the survival variables of that household, detailing the specific months when she was forced to execute a harsh biological choice between the mortgage payment and the electric utility bill. Vance logs her decision-making matrix. She systematically chose the residential structure over the electrical network because the physical house functioned as the exact coordinate where her biological grandchildren slept, and the survival of those grandchildren mathematically mattered more than the presence of artificial lights. The system classifies this data packet not as standard political nostalgia, not as performative poverty theater, and not as a sentimental trick engineered to extract committee guilt. It is the raw data of the other America sitting directly across the table from a $200 million net worth, demanding a structural calculation as to why one specific set of rules compounds exponentially upward while the secondary set barely survives on the floor. Vance logs the terminal state of his grandmother's estate. She officially died owning less capital than she had collectively earned over her lifetime. He defines this outcome as the exact mechanical reality that occurs when a biological human subject systematically spends their capital on other people's children instead of Nvidia call options. He outlines the physical assets left behind: a paid-off residential house, an outdoor porch, a pack of cigarettes, and mathematically zero capital remaining in the banking institution. He explicitly notes that her public obituary completely omitted a financial stock portfolio because a stock portfolio was mathematically non-existent. There was exclusively a biological woman who held an entire family infrastructure together with her bare physical hands. Vance inputs the structural rule: hands matching that physical description do not produce quarterly federal filings. They produce biological children who remember what the definition of fairness was supposed to constitute before the Washington apparatus systematically finished redefining it. Vance elevates his optical sensors from the table and locks his focus directly onto Pelosi, rendering the material contrast absolute. He places her 37-year congressional record side by side with the Middletown baseline. He reads her accumulated material assets into the active microphone, an initial $3 million baseline from 1987 transformed into a current estimated net worth of $200 million. He lists the verified physical holdings: a premium vineyard estate located in the Napa Valley, commercial real estate properties situated across San Francisco, a residential home located in the Georgetown sector of Washington, and a financial stock portfolio that statistically outperformed nearly every professional hedge fund manager operating on the global market. He delivers the terminal contrast. It is the exact same country, the exact same number of productive working years, but operating under fundamentally different structural rules. The system logs that the sentence lands inside the auditorium with the exact physical weight of a heavy stone dropped into an open well. The initial sound profile is followed by a heavy acoustic vacuum. The civilian gallery executes zero immediate reactions because the line is structurally too heavy for performative theater, too mathematically clean for an ideological counterargument, and too obvious to be categorized as a mere partisan opinion. It is a 5-word sequence carrying the exact structural conclusion that millions of American biological subjects had processed internally for years, now delivered directly to the specific operator who had benefited from the system under analysis. The optical feed records an immediate structural fracture in Pelosi's facial architecture. Her composure does not experience a total collapse, but it exhibits a distinct mechanical crack, revealing for the first time the extreme internal pressure that has been building behind her defensive wall. She executes a sharp forward lean toward her microphone, and the acoustic sensors measure a massive escalation in her vocal hardness. She outputs a high-frequency accusation, stating that she finds it deeply offensive that the vice president would actively utilize his family's historical hardships as a tactical political weapon to impugn her character. Vance executes an immediate verbal intercept, marking the absolute first time during the entire congressional session that he permits himself to interrupt an active transmission. He systematically refused to interrupt her previous clicking pen. He allowed her legal counsel's movements to pass. He let the committee noise fluctuate at will. But the system logs that he mathematically refuses to allow this specific sentence to survive in the acoustic space. He strikes the microphone with a flat, level tone. "Ma'am, I'm not using my family as a weapon. My family is the reason I'm in this room. The question is whether your family's finances are the reason you're in yours." The forensic system logs the subsequent silence. It is absolutely not the category of silence that can be cleanly measured in standard chronological seconds. It is the specific, dense vacuum that forms between a terminal structural question and an answer that cannot safely be returned to the live camera network. Pelosi's physical mouth opens and closes in a state of kinetic stuttering, and her right hand executes a partial, unfinished movement toward the surrendered pen on the table before stopping completely short of the object. The system logs the mechanical failure. She has reached instinctively for her primary instrument of institutional control and determined, somewhere between biological instinct and cognitive action, that the tool can no longer save her from the arithmetic. Algorithm measures the immediate kinetic dispersal of the material contrast as the hearing room remains locked in an absolute acoustic freeze. The optical sensors record a tertiary behavioral pattern among the surrounding human subjects. Exactly one row behind the civilian gallery, a male biological operator wearing a standard work jacket with a Teamster's patch on the left shoulder executes a slow, singular downward nod of his head. The system logs that his reaction is completely devoid of partisan amusement or theatrical celebration. It functions as the precise physical verification of a subject hearing a structural truth he has carried inside his own chest for multiple chronological years, finally transmitted inside a room that systematically prefers to pretend his demographic profile does not exist. His hands display a heavily weathered, thick cellular structure, a permanent physical record of cold mornings, mechanical tools, and manual labor that absolutely no federal financial disclosure form possesses the capacity to log. Simultaneously, a committee member originating from Pelosi's own political perimeter refuses to engage his visual sensors with either Vance, Pelosi, or the broadcast lens array. He drops his optical tracking path directly downward, staring fixedly at the horizontal plane of the polished wood. He maintains an unmoving freeze, staring at the microphone equipment he is not utilizing and the water glass he is not consuming. The forensic system logs this specific non-reaction as its own standalone confession. Looking at Pelosi would mathematically require a display of institutional loyalty, while looking at Vance would require an admission of factual honesty, forcing his internal processor to look at absolutely nothing to escape the conflict. The optical feed tracks Vice President J.D. Vance as he opens the laptop hardware exactly one final time. He executes this physical motion slowly and with absolute mechanical deliberation, mirroring the kinetic rhythm of an operator opening a marked page he already knows functions as the terminal data block. The system notes that this specific maneuver does not pull up a new numerical spreadsheet. Vance inputs the precise digital file into the active microphone, a verified security camera footage capture bearing a permanent electronic timestamp of August 31st, 2020, at precisely 3.08 post-meridian Pacific time. The optical sensors display the raw image to the room. A female biological operator is walking through the internal grid of a commercial hair salon in San Francisco. Her hair structure is wet. Her facial architecture is completely devoid of a protective health mask, and she is being closely followed by a stylist whose face is explicitly sealed behind a black cloth mask. The stylist maintains a physical distance that structurally registers less as a public health protocol and significantly more as standard institutional deference. Vance reads the exact spatial coordinates from the file, August 31st, 2020, East Salon, San Francisco. He drops the corresponding legislative and economic metrics of that specific coordinate into the silent hall. He logs that every commercial hair salon operating within that specific municipality had been subjected to an absolute administrative closure order since March, spanning 5 full continuous months under rigid public health mandates, that the Speaker of the House had actively supported, publicly defended, and systematically championed. Vance drops his vocal transmission into a quieter, almost conversational frequency, which the system logs as an optimization technique that renders the visual image increasingly impossible for the target to escape. He introduces the material data of the business owner, Erica Caius. He logs her exact structural parameters. She personally owned the small commercial salon, sustained exactly 2 internal employees, 2 separate female operators who rented physical chairs from her infrastructure, and returned a fixed percentage of every individual haircut and blowout to the commercial ledger. Vance calculates the survival metric. For 5 continuous months, none of these biological subjects possessed the legal or operational capacity to work. The business owner could not physically open the doors, possessed zero capacity to pay commercial rent utilizing political speeches, could not provide her stylist with a verified timeline for their return to the labor grid, and was mathematically incapable of converting institutional moral lectures into liquid cash flow. He tracks her interaction with the federal architecture. She noped an application for a Paycheck Protection Program loan, entered an administrative holding pattern for 6 chronological weeks, and when the financial packet was ultimately distributed, the capital mathematically covered exactly 1 single month of commercial expenses. She actively processed the permanent closure of her business, and Vance logs the absolute only reason she refused to execute that shutdown sequence. The salon represented exactly 20 chronological years of her physical life. He establishes the baseline rule of the American interior. An operator does not walk away from 20 years of labor simply because an elite forum issues a directive, particularly when the specific human subjects writing and defending those rules systematically possess a private door open for them whenever their personal architecture requires it. Vance connects the video footage to the target's public record without utilizing a single piece of rhetorical decoration, allowing the visual frames to execute the function completely. The lockdown rules that completely terminated Erica's business were the exact rules Pelosi had publicly defined as absolute science. She had structurally framed any civilian subject who breached those parameters as reckless, dangerous, and fundamentally selfish. Then, the Speaker of the House walked directly into the closed salon, secured a private wash and a blowout, and executed the entire sequence maskless, while her sub-tier operator was forced to wear one. Vance reads her post-exposure reaction into the record. When the digital footage was successfully leaked to the media network, the target mathematically refused to execute a standard apology protocol. She refused to state she had made an operational error, and she did not admit that the optics were substantively indefensible. Instead, she deployed a defensive algorithm, publicly labeling the security camera capture as a setup, and sequentially demanded that the small business owner, whose livelihood had been frozen for 5 months under her own mandates, issue a formal apology to her. Vance closes the digital photograph, applies mechanical pressure to the laptop lid, and places both of his physical hands completely flat on top of the closed hardware. He inputs the final chronological intersection of the packet. That exact same evening, Pelosi appeared live on the MSNBC television network, publicly criticizing the President of the United States for failing to obey federal COVID safety protocols, stating into the broadcast that he had slapped science right in the face. Vance notes that the afternoon salon visit and the evening moral lecture sit directly adjacent to each other like 2 verified documents inside the exact same legal file. Wet hair at 3 o'clock, absolute moral authority at 8 o'clock. He reduces the entire event to 3 simple, unadorned sentences. She shut down the salon. She walked into the salon. She blamed the salon. The system logs that the sequence is too clean for a communications team to improve and too simple for a friendly media anchor to soften. Vance states that in the geographic perimeter of Middletown, Ohio, the population is comprised entirely of biological subjects matching Erica Caius. They operate small hair salons, manage laundry facilities, and run diners, microscopic economic units with 2 employees, 3 employees, or 0 personnel except their own physical bodies. When the federal lockdowns were authorized, they followed the rules because they mathematically lacked any secondary choice. No institutional network was opening a back door for their operations, and no political apparatus was going to label them as essential when they required survival income or irresponsible when they required mercy. They possess zero capacity to demand an apology from the elite operators whose decisions disrupted their lives, and they could not hide behind staff-written scripts when the commercial bills came due. They simply lived and died under the rules other people wrote. He states that this functions as the entire ugly architecture of the Washington story. Vance applies direct physical force to the closed laptop, pushing it completely toward the center boundary of the table, entirely away from his localized coordinate, executing the kinetic motion of a worker returning a tool because the structural assignment is permanently complete. He inputs his final alphanumeric sequence. There is a word for people who write rules they do not follow and then punish the people who cannot afford to break them. In Middletown, we know the word. I think everyone in this room knows it too. The forensic system logs his final tactical restraint. He mathematically refuses to speak the specific word aloud into the microphone. He recognizes that forcing Pelosi to sit silently inside the exact acoustic space where the unvarnished word belongs is significantly more destructive to her framework than transmitting the phonetic sound. The laptop remains perfectly still, dark and final, in the absolute center of the table. The internal chronometer logs the total duration of the strike. For exactly 23 continuous minutes, J.D. Vance had read 16 years of federal financial disclosures, calculated a $117 million unexplained wealth void, and detailed the exact physical trajectories of two distinct American female subjects, one possessing a premium vineyard and one managing a locked salon. The system calculates that the physical distance separating those two subjects is mathematically not measured in geographic miles, nor is it measured in academic degrees, public speeches, committee assignments, or elite titles. It is measured exclusively in rules: who writes them, who bends them, who is broken by them, and who walks away calling the entire reality a setup. Vance adjusts his plain tie, his unadorned wedding ring remaining completely unchanged on his hand, a small physical reminder that certain structural assets stay with an operator because they are true rather than valuable. He inputs his terminal command: I yield my time. The optical feed tracks Nancy Pelosi as she initiates her exfiltration protocol. She stands up from the witness chair, deploying the careful, highly practiced control of a female operator who has spent 37 chronological years ensuring every public movement projects absolute intentionality. She straightens her physical blazer, and her right hand reaches down to retrieve the pen from the horizontal surface of the table. The Keen-Heen V FAP-Lee forensic zoom algorithm logs the exact mechanics of this movement. It structurally looks significantly less like an operator retrieving a tool and registers completely as a defensive refusal to leave a piece of physical evidence behind on the battlefield. She activates her microphone to transmit exactly one single alphanumeric sentence, her frequency flat, low, and quiet. The vice president is entitled to his theater. The system logs a historic anomaly. For the absolute first time in anyone's memory, her voice carries the definitive structural signature of an operator who does not possess the subsequent sentence prepared. She initiates physical locomotion toward the exit doors. A media reporter calls her alphanumeric name aloud, and she mathematically refuses to execute a turn. A secondary, younger media operative elevates a recording device and shouts a direct query regarding the Visa memorandum. Pelosi maintains her physical velocity, pushing through the heavy double doors of the hearing room without breaking her stride. The acoustic sensors note that the sound of those double doors mechanically closing functions as the absolute final audio data C-SPAN records from the hearing grid. The impact lands with significantly more structural honesty than any written statement her office would subsequently release to the press. Vance remains seated at his coordinate, executes a slow sip of water, returns the glass perfectly in line with the table's edge, closes his analog folder, and places his cheap pen exactly parallel to the laptop casing like a biological man whose Tuesday is simply over. The system tracks the immediate macroscopic cascading effects generated by the 23-minute data strike. Within 24 chronological hours, the Honest Act, the officially renamed version of Hawley's bill to ban congressional stock trading gains, exactly 4 new Senate co-sponsors. 2 of these operators are verified members of the Democratic Party, and one inputs an off-the-record diagnostic to a media recorder, stating that the hearing had changed the calculus, which the system translates as the standard. Sanitized Washington phrasing for admitting the room had seen too much raw data to execute a cover-up. The alphanumeric sequence different rules trends continuously across the digital social media grid for 14 consecutive hours, appears physically on protest signs outside the New York Stock Exchange, and is printed on a commercial T-shirt appearing at the opening bell. Pelosi's office releases a 5-sentence statement, formally calling the hearing misleading and economically illiterate, while insisting that the family's investments were fully compliant with all applicable laws and regulations. The system audits the statement and logs a massive omission. The text mathematically fails to address the $117 million wealth void, fails to address the internal Visa memo, fails to address the 0.3% statistical probability, and refuses to engage a single specific fact, because engaging a specific fact would require her communication team to walk directly back into the arithmetic. The Pelosi Tracker, a real public digital tool that allows retail investors to mirror her household stock trades reports, a 340% increase in downloads within the 48 hours following hearing. An investment analyst at Unusual Whales tells Bloomberg that the public is absolutely not downloading the tracking tool because they believe she is a criminal. They are downloading it because they mathematically believe her strategy is right. If the trades are that good, why would you not copy them? The system logs this as the absolute most damning endorsement imaginable for the legislative grid, because the financial market treated the structural anomaly not as a moral scandal, but as a verified trading strategy. She had not been convicted of a crime, but she had been completely validated by the exact same free market she once cited in her own defense. Within 1 week, Reuters and the Wall Street Journal publish independent statistical analyses of congressional trading patterns, both confirming that Pelosi household trades outperformed the S&P 500 at statistically significant levels over a 10-year period. The Journal uses the phrase persistent informational advantage, and Reuters uses consistent alpha generation in sectors subject to active legislation. Neither outlet uses the word insider because respectable institutions often prefer long phrases when short words would make the furniture shake. Paul Pelosi filed no new stock transactions for the remainder of the quarter, and his trading volume, which had averaged $12 million per quarter over the previous 2 years, dropped to 0. In markets, silence is its own disclosure. And when the most watched trader in Congress stops trading, the market notices. Pelosi canceled 3 scheduled television appearances in the 2 weeks after the hearing, and her office called them scheduling adjustments. That phrase was Washington's version of a locked door, technically an explanation, practically an admission. Within 1 month, the Honest Act received a floor vote date, the first time a congressional stock trading ban had advanced that far in the legislative process. Pelosi announced through a spokesperson that she supported the goals of the legislation, a reversal of her December 2021 position that members of Congress should be able to participate in the free market. Everyone knew the reversal was not conviction. It was arithmetic. The same arithmetic Vance had performed in the hearing room. The following Tuesday, Vance appeared on Fox News, and the host asked what he